Well, we're back and we're going to have the second of two video lectures on chapter 3. One of the things that we see about record storage and retrieval in a record environment is something that we see more and more of is data mining and data analysis. What data mining is basically looking through the data in an electronic health record system to find out something we need to know. For example, if we want to look at and understand how many patients are taking a certain medication that could be led to a certain linked to a certain condition, we can ask for that and mine the information out. Right. Or if we wanted to see how many people have a borderline A1C, so we could refer them to a diabetic case manager or nurse educator. Those are different things that we can mine with the data. When we look at it, analyze, and draw meaningful conclusions, we're talking about data analysis. One of the things that we see in both electronic records and paper records is how we deal with amendments or addendums, how we do corrections. Back in the paper record era, the provider would draw a line through the text that they wanted to addend, initial it, and date it. Now, of course, with electronic health records, it will put in what an addendum is, right? And of course, we have different tools to ensure the data quality. We have input masks, drop-down menus that limit the choices that people can stick in a text field, and so on. One of the things that can be problematic with electronic health records is the screen design. Ideally, you want to have things organized so it makes sense with the more demographic information on top, neutral colors. You want to have undo buttons, screens that confirm the final entry before it's authenticated, certain fields being required. And the main idea is to minimize keystrokes, make it as easy as possible for providers to enter information. That's why electronic health record systems continue to evolve. One of the things that we hear a lot about is identifying. In other words, what is the unique identifier for a patient to match them up with whatever the electronic health information is? Typically, this is a health record number, more commonly referred to as a medical record number. And what a master patient index does, or an MPI, is it matches a particular patient with a particular health record number. There are other ways, of course, of identifying patients. You could identify them alphabetically, alphanumerically, and all these other different types of things. But far and away, the most common way to do it is with a numeric identifier. In other words, a health record number / medical record number that is mapped to an individual patient in a master patient index. With paper records, we can have several different ways of doing this. We can have serial numbering. In other words, every time a patient comes into the clinic, they get a unique identifier for that encounter, and they get a new health record number for each visit. Far and away, something that's much more popular is the unit record, the unit numbering. In other words, we have one health record number for all the encounters that the patient has in the organization. Another term that we'll hear a lot of, and these have survived paper records and continue to be with us, are two terms: registries and vital statistics. Let's talk about registries first. Registries are basically a collection of information or databases, and they're on a common topic. So everybody in a cancer registry has some sort of reportable type of cancer. Everybody in a trauma registry, all those patients have been taken to a trauma center and so on. Vital statistics we think of as birth and death certificates and marriage certificates. Some of the departments that health information management interfaces most commonly with are patient registration. And again, this goes back to the master patient index concept. We want to have each medical record number or health record number only belonging to one patient, right? We also work closely in health information with billing, reimbursement, patient care departments, IT, and quality management. More and more HIM positions are becoming virtual. Coders that work for large organizations like Peace Health, Providence, and Kaiser Permanente all, for the most part, work at home. There are a few organizations where the HIM departments have a centralized function for release of information that handles all release of information for one centralized site. But more and more of these positions are going remote. And again, we see these functions on this slide: the disclosure or release of health information, coding, registries, billing, quality improvement, clinical decision support, personal health records. They've always been with us, but now with electronics and electronic health information, we see them being more virtual by their nature. When we use the term encoder or grouper, we're talking about an electronic code book that you access via a computer. And the grouper is what takes the patient diagnosis and puts it into a diagnostic related group. As things become more automated, and especially now with AI, auditing is going to be key. AI, as we know, does hallucinate. Not everything that it comes up with is 100% accurate. And so we need to do verification to make sure the diagnosis codes that are submitted are supported by the documentation. And these can take the form of both internal or external audits. And that's all I have for you. Please reach out if you have any questions about any of this material. Bye now.